Hello, everyone, and welcome to continuing broadcast of International Podcast Day 2019 as we continue to go around the globe and bring you podcasters and just all kinds of great information from across the world. Before we get into this next session, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Our platinum sponsor is Blueberry, full service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, podcast statistics, and podcast advertisement opportunities. Repurpose.io automatically converts your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. That's repurpose.io. And Libsyn. Libsyn is a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for audio and video podcasters worldwide. Well, I'm really looking forward to our next session from the United Kingdom with Becca. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, and it's great to have you on this year. And you have some really, I'm going to say, interesting information to bring to us. I guess that might be a good way to put it. And so, without further ado, I'm going to let you take it over.
Great, thank you. Hello everybody. I'm Becca Bryers and I make the podcast Multi-Story for the BBC, for BBC Local Radio. And I'm basically going to be talking you through how I make the podcast, because basically, as I said in the title, it's kind of recycling radio. So it's a podcast that's largely made up of radio broadcasts. So I'm going to be talking about the process of that. I'm going to introduce you a little bit about myself first, and also about what BBC Local Radio is, because you may not know, as this is an international audience. I am happy to answer questions as I go along. I know the guys are keeping an eye on questions coming through. So yeah, if you have questions, then I'll keep an eye out for them. And it might be stuff that's coming up, and then I'll get to it. And if not, I'll see if I can answer it at the end if I haven't already. So bear with me, because I don't know how the technicals are going to work, because my mouse has suddenly just stopped working. So we'll see how it goes. But basically, let's talk quickly about me, but not dwell on it too much. So let me see if I go here. Oh, let's see if this is working. Come on. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. There we go. Cool, there we go. Who am I? So basically, most of my career has been spent in BBC Local Radio, which I'll go into more detail in a moment. But I've mainly worked in live radio. So you can see me there behind the glass, producing in the bottom right-hand corner, producing a live radio show, and doing a lot of weekend shows and quite diversity of shows. So a lot of kind of talk radio, long, in-depth interviews, as opposed to kind of the hard news stuff. I've also done reporting, and I've also done a little bit of a stint in radio management. I've also done a documentary series, co-produced that for BBC Radio 4, which was kind of my enter into doing kind of more craft radio, which is relevant to the podcasting. I also volunteer a bit for National Prison Radio, so a particular show that goes out in prisons across England, so it's only the inmates that hear it. Again, relevant, this will come up later. And that thing at the bottom that says Vylor, that was basically a training program that I was part of. But I've done quite a bit of training of journalists on broadcast equipment, and technology that helps them do the broadcasting, again, is very relevant. And finally, I put this up here because I'm sure if you've tuned into International Podcast Day before, then you'll know about Podcast Brunch Club, which is basically fans coming together to talk about podcasts. It's basically a book club, but for podcasts. And I put that up there to show that not only am I a maker, but I'm actually a massive listener of podcasts, which is a big part of me coming to making my podcast, as much as kind of my background in radio. And it's also to kind of show that I've learned the podcasting thing a little bit as I've gone along, because it's of course it's been going for a good number of years now, but in some ways it's quite a new, exciting area. So just because I'm a radio producer doesn't mean I have all the answers at all. So that's who I am. So moving on, local radio. So I'm sorry if I'm telling you stuff you already know, but actually, even if you're from Britain, people don't always necessarily know kind of the makeup of the BBC. So headline people know a lot of our network national radio stations, TV shows like Radio 1, Radio 4, and then the BBC 1 and 2 channels and that kind of thing. But actually, we have lots of smaller stations around the BBC. So there's this thing called BBC English Regions, which actually just takes in, as you can see here, doesn't include Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. They kind of have their own system going on, but includes everything from northeast Cumberland down. So we're divided into these 12 regions in English regions, and each one of these areas, it has its own kind of local TV service. So we have news bulletins that come from there and other news programmings around it, and they also have their news online teams. So they have people, journalists who are specifically looking at stories that are going on those areas, who also work with the national teams. So if you want to know what I am talking to you from right now, I'm right in the bit that's yellow and in the East Midlands in a city called Leicester. So that is where I live, and it's often where I work from. So I'm actually joining you in my home office, which is also our spare bedroom and music room. So that is where I do a lot of my work. So that is BBC English Regions, and then we break that down into BBC Local Radio. So each of those regions has a different number of stations in it. So you'll see some have only one. So London is its own region and its own station, and then some have quite a few more. So you can see in the East Midlands, there's Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham. So they'll have a particular transmission area that they'll transmit to, and they'll collect stories from, and they try and represent them. So there's 39 in all. It's sometimes up to debate because some of the stations have separate radio breakfast shows, and they're all broadcasting from about 5 or 6 in the morning till about 10 o'clock at night. There's a little bit of sharing of shows that go on, but generally they're producing their own stuff. They go out on FM, so they'll have kind of a set area. Obviously, it can't be contained, so you can, here in Leicester, I can sometimes pick up Nottingham and Derby, but largely that's the case. And also on digital radio and online. And there's a mixture of music and chat. Some bits of the breakfast show are completely chat. A lot of the later bits in the day is music. There's loads of chat and loads of stories. So basically, I'm going to stop that screen for a second. So basically, the idea for the podcast came about because basically of my background in local radio and traveling around doing the training as well, visiting all of these stations. I mean, it is so obvious when I say it, but being exposed to all the different stations, you start to realize what a wealth of stories there is. And actually, it's fine, I'm interested in stuff that's happening in Leicester because I live in Leicester, but I can equally be interested in a personal story in Newcastle or in Lancashire or in London or whatever, as long as it's a personal story, because you can connect with it and you can be interested about the world elsewhere. But there's also, I found, a novelty in the uniqueness that these places have too. So, there's some universal elements of us all being people, but there's also, the uniqueness in how different people speak and their experiences of the world and how the landscape and what surrounds them and the industry and that kind of thing influences them. And then the other thing that I thought is it's kind of a bit sad, really, that I'm only getting to hear some of the great stuff I was hearing as I was traveling around the country when I was in that particular place. Because sure, I can get it online, and internationally you can get it online, but you wouldn't necessarily know to go there to look for it. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if there was a way of doing that? And I should also mention that the stuff that's online, it does go on to BBC Sounds, but the broadcast stuff generally only stays up for 30 days and then it disappears. So, so I thought, well, here's an idea for a podcast then. So the idea for Multi-Story was born. And let me see if I can just share my screen with you again. Oops. Okay, there you go. You should be able to see it now. Okay, so this is the multi-story. So the one on the left, that's our original logo that we had for the first series, and then the one on the right is a redesign that we had, which I think probably reflects the podcast a little bit more, and this idea that you've got all these voices in your head. So multi-story, what it isn't and what we didn't want it to be was kind of just radio highlights that were, quickly edited together and kind of just shoved on and done a little bit of an intro at the end and an outro. An intro at the beginning and outro at the end. We kind of also wanted it to not be news stuff. We kind of wanted it to be these personal stories. That's not to say it doesn't reflect things that are in the news or, social issues, etc. But we didn't want it to be breaking news type of a thing. And I guess we didn't want it to be just the same as the radio, because like I said, you can go and listen to that anyway. So what it is, or what I hope it is this recycling of radio, but it's actually really reversioning of radio. So it's reversioning stories and audio to work for a podcasting audience, and I'll talk about how we try and do that in a little bit. So what you hear when you tune into multi-story is you hear 3 or 4 stories. It's usually about 30 to 40 minutes long, so each story is somewhere between 6 and 12 minutes usually, and they are linked by me. I'm the guide in between the stories, and yeah, we try to get a mix of stories in there that are from radio, regional TV, etc., and a diversity of people and voices and experiences in there. And I really want to try and make it so it is coming from local radio but has universal appeal. So let me go on to the next screen. Before I kind of talk to you about how I go about making the show, I thought that it'd be nice to just play you a little bit of taste for it, because I presume most people haven't actually heard it. And this guy, Farmer Wink, is a great person to start with, and is a great example of the diversity of the language and accents in our small country. So let me just play this clip out for you. Oops, let's try that again.
Think of the longest journey you've taken and the form of transport you took. Now think of the tallest, most impressive building you've been in. And then the most people you've seen collected together in one place. And just keep them in mind. Farmer Wink lived in Lincolnshire on the same farm, in pretty much the same house for his entire life. He's very rarely crossed the Lincolnshire border. For him, there's no need to follow a yellow brick road to come to the no place like home. But when BBC Radio Lincolnshire presenter William Wright suggested a day trip to the capital, Wink was persuaded to give it a go.
So here we are, Lincoln Central Station. It's quite busy actually, a lot of commuters just arriving to get the early trains out of here. And look who's here, Farmer Wink. How are you doing?
All right, how are you?
Now this, even being here, we're standing on the platform, even being here, that's a first for you.
It is a first. Never been to a station in my life.
Why? How come you've got to the age you are and you've never ever been on a train?
I don't know. Never wanted to go on a sleigh. I never knew where to go on a sleigh.
There's a whole world out there, Wink.
Oh, the whole world of two of it there.
Well, no, this is what we've been saying. We've been saying basically, you have left Lincolnshire in the past, but most of your life is near where you live.
That's about all. Go to Louth, cattle market in Louth. There about Louth about before the list I've been. Hey,
This will be the fastest you've ever travelled, I think, won't it?
I should say so. Hey, about 30 miles an hour is about my limit.
And what do you think it's going to be like?
Oh, hey, that was your key to the tracks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to
So yeah, part of the reason I wanted to play that to start with is just to give you a feel for the tone of the show. But also Farmer Wink is almost part of he's kind of the person that almost inspired the podcast really as well, because when I was traveling around being a trainer, one of my fellow trainers was a guy called William Wright, and he was a presenter from BBC Radio Lincolnshire, which is in the east of England. And he was talking to me about this guy, Farmer Wink, who he'd met was a regular person on his show, and had mentioned the fact that he'd never been on a train. And you know, this guy's in his like late 60s and had never been on a train in his life, and that William had taken him on a train to London for the day. And I thought it just sounded so great that I asked Williams to send me the audio, and I listened and I loved it. It was actually an hour-long documentary he'd done, and I was kind of sad that I'd never heard it before. And the reason I'd never heard it before is because I don't live in Lincolnshire, and therefore, you know, I wouldn't have known about it. And it was actually kind of archive audio, so it was like 4 or 5 years old. So it was kind of before the point, perhaps, when we were uploading a lot of the audio to BBC Sounds like we do now. But it was still brilliant, and it kind of demonstrates everything that I want and strive to have for multi-story, which is, you know, he's got great character, he's got that great accent, which, you know, even though I've listened to the audio so much, it's so broad that sometimes I don't understand all of it. And actually, funnily enough, although it is quite broad, particularly further on in the piece, I've had people from other countries who struggle even more with it, absolutely loving him, because, you know, it is unique, it's quirky, and you get a lot of his character even if you can't pick up the complete nuance of what he's saying. But also, you know, it's surprising that he's never been on a train, but he's also really relatable, and a lot of the things he talks about on the train journey, about, you know, growing up and you know, kids kind of being a bit mean to him because he was slightly different, but also the sense of what home means to him and why it's important, you know, that they're kind of relatable, universal things. And also what I really like about him, and I try and achieve through multi-story, is it's someone that you wouldn't necessarily meet in real life, unless you happen to go to his farm and his little village, because he doesn't often leave. So that's also what I want to do. It kind of, you know, a window into other people's lives. So let me just go back out of that. So going to stop sharing the screen a second and get to where I was. So, and the other nice thing about Farmer Wink's story, he was the first ever story in the whole of multi-story. So he really set it up. You know, the other great thing about it in terms of recycling radio is the fact that not only was he in the podcast, we then re-uploaded the whole of the documentary so that people who had heard that and liked it could go and listen to the whole documentary. And now that exists on the BBC website forever, so that's up there too. And I also revisited the story because it was 5 years old, and had an update with Farmer Wink about how he feels about going to London and going on the train now. So that's a little bit of a taste of it. So now I just want to talk a little bit about finding the stories, and how I find the stories. So originally, finding the stories was challenging. In the first series of Multi-Story, it was quite challenging, because no one really knew what I was doing. It was a new thing, and it was kind of difficult to explain, I guess, because we were kind of finding our way as we went along with it. So gradually in the second series, it's become easier, and now we're onto the third series. And so most of the stories come from radio, from BBC local radio. They've already been broadcast, or sometimes I'm catching stuff now just as it's about to come up to broadcast, or it's been on one of our regional TV shows. There's one called Inside Out, which does quite a lot of investigative storytelling, and they might do really long interviews, but only a tiny bit of it makes onto the TV. So I'm kind of capturing more of the personal stories, and sometimes they come from our digital teams. So, you know, there's been digital videos that people have made, and I've either taken the audio from that, or at least taken the story and gone and recorded my own audio. A lot of the time, journalists are sending me these stories because one of the first questions I often get asked is, gosh, you must listen to so many stations. But as I've already said, there's 39 stations, and they're each broadcasting hours and hours and hours a day. It wouldn't be possible for me to listen, even just to do the listening. So yeah, a lot of it is from people pointing me in the right direction. Some of it's just by chance. Sometimes I'll be scrolling online and see an online article and then go and contact the station and say, have you done an audio version of this? Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways that I come across the audio. It isn't very clear, but when I'm kind of communicating to people what audio I want, there's key things that I'm looking out for. So it's about, I want them to have this universal element. So I want it to be surprising, but relatable at the same time. I want the person that they're doing to be quite authentic. I want the interviewer to be engaged, the person that's interviewing them, and I want the interviewee to be engaged as well. You want them to be interesting. I'm also looking for quality of the recording, which pretty much comes as standard because it's a BBC thing. And as I said, long is good for me. So a lot of the audio that goes out on our radio stations is cut down into packages that are 3 or 4 minutes long. If it's for our breakfast shows, that tends to be what they take. And then some of the other shows, they'll have longer interviews. Sometimes it's stuff recorded out and about. Sometimes it's studio. I've even taken stuff that's on the phone. Because as I say, even with I suppose when I go back to the quality thing, sometimes, the quality of the audio could be better, but the story is good enough that you're kind of willing to ignore that. So yeah, long is good. So sometimes, one thing that's worked really good for me in the third series, is a lot of stuff in the first series had already been broadcast. So, sadly, there were great stories that I couldn't use because they'd have been edited down to 3 minutes, which isn't kind of long enough for me. And also maybe the producer had beautifully mixed in commercial music that then, I haven't got the rights to use on the podcast. So, if I can't get that original audio and a lot of it had purged, there was not much I could do about it. But now producers are aware of what I'm looking for. So, it's great when they can save that raw recording from me, and then I can use that. And it's also great because, it's sad, I know, I've been out and done recordings for shows where the producer says to me, oh, we only need 2 minutes of that, and I've recorded half an hour of lovely stuff and I just can't include it. So it's nice to not lose that. So yeah, that is basically what I'm looking for. And I say to people, it's almost like social media, like I want the shareable stuff. Like the best way to explain it, because I think in local radio we often think, oh, big stories, our best stories are those big news stories, like fires or holding politicians to account, or investigative reports, that kind of thing, politics, and they're so important, and that's a massive thing of what local radio does, and is kind of there on the ground in the communities doing those kind of stories. But that's not quite what I want for multi-story, and I think people at first were surprised that actually some of the stuff I want almost seems just a little bit mundane and everyday, but still mundane and everyday. Sometimes there's something about a particular person that you speak to that's, you can't get out of your head. So I was saying it's the stories that you go home to your friends and your family and you mention in the pub, oh, you'll never guess what story I did. I spoke to this farmer who'd never been on a train. Can you believe it? And, a few years later, you might still be thinking about. So that's the kind of thing I want. But, when I'm finding this audio, actually, I'm not finding the audio. I'm doing the second step of that. It's almost easy in comparison to what all my colleagues in local radio are doing. Like people, I'm the presenter, producer of the podcast, but really there's lots of presenters and producers of this podcast because I'm just kind of reusing and showcasing the work of my colleagues in local radio. So yeah, actually finding the stories, and this is relatable to anyone listening who's finding stories, a lot of it's just done on the ground. Like a lot of the stories that come into local radio, yes, some of them will be from press releases, but a lot of them are from the fact that the reporters and the presenters and the producers are living in the communities where they're working. So, I know that a lot of the stories that I put on air when I was producing live radio shows at Radio Leicester were stories, because I'd read something in a local newspaper, I'd read something in the window of my local shop, I'd overheard something at a bus stop it's because my dad was moaning to me about something. So a lot of the stories are actually coming from the ground. And I thought, a way to just show this as well. So especially in the first series, some of the stories that I put in the first series because I was struggling for material from local radio, and also because I was trying to establish myself as a host. I did some original interviews too that hadn't previously been broadcast on radio. So I thought I could play a few clips of those now and just talk through how I found those. So let me just, oops, I will get the hang of this by the end, I'm sure. Let me just click that. And then I'm going to share my screen with you again. Just do a bit of clicking here. Okay, so let me just play this to you.
It was an interesting year. I'd socially transitioned in the UK, not at work, but socially transitioned. And then I detransitioned to Australia because I had no choice.
How does it feel at that point when you finally think, actually, I feel like the world's seeing me as male and I want to be female? Yeah, then to have to go back in.
I thought it through, but I didn't. It was harder than I expected. I'd gone too far. I'd opened myself up too much.
We were in the flat and Gabs went to the toilet and then you ran in while she was in the toilet and started punching me in the tummy. You said, "I hate you. You're not my dad. Stay away from my mum. You've changed my life." And then I think I went outside and went for a walk by the beach and cried.
Can you remember it? No.
Really? Can you not?
I was in my room and my mum called me and she was sort of half whispering because I think she didn't want my sister to hear, but she was like, "Get ready, we have to go." I'm like, "Where are we going?" She's like, "I need birds." I'm like, "You don't need birds, not again, because this is a conversation we've had so many times."
So what you had there, you had 3 stories, which are original stories that made it to multi-story, and then actually, rather than recycling radio, I actually gave them back to radio, and then the local radio stations played them. But it's just really to indicate where stories come from anywhere, and I'm sure loads of you will know this, but sometimes it's great to be reminded of the different places. So Chrissy was the first question you had. So Chrissy's a trans woman, and I've met her doing a story for National Prison Radio. I said it would link back. So yeah, she was a guest talking about something completely different, a project she was involved in. But before she went into the studio, we were just chatting and she told me so many fascinating stuff about her life, that she'd worked in North Korea, that she'd worked in Libya, etc., etc. And I just said to her, "Look, I really want to interview you at some point about how fascinating you are. Is it okay if I keep your details?" And then it took 3 years until I was working on multi-story and I'd remembered her. You see that idea of just remember the people you never forget about. And I thought, I'm going to get back in touch with her now. And so, yeah, we recorded a story about her searching for something she wasn't quite sure of, which ended up being partly about her gender identity. Then the second story you heard, that was John and Gabs and Ivor, her son, who are in the picture on the right hand side. And that was a story that I found on a train. So John was talking to some colleagues on a train, and I was eavesdropping, and he sounded fascinating because he was talking about the fact he'd fallen in love with this woman who had a 7-year-old, and how he was kind of navigating the fact that he had a new relationship, but he also had a new relationship with his little boy and all the pressures that put on. And yeah, my heart was thumping as I got off the train and just kind of said, "I'm really sorry, but can I give you my number? I'm a radio producer." And it turns out he didn't think it was that weird and got in touch with me, and I recorded him for the podcast. So, strangers, a great source of stories. And then the final bit you heard was a woman called Noor who lives in London, and she was talking about this amazing story of her mum going on a secret mission to go and get some parakeets that she wanted. And that was a story I found on Twitter. So a friend retweeted this thread that Noor had put on there about this really funny night they had going to get these parakeets. And I could just hear it as an audio story, and I contacted Noor and said, "How do you feel about it?" And initially her mum was a bit hesitant to talk because she's originally from Pakistan and she wasn't super confident about her English being recorded, but actually she was great, and I think it ended up being a really warm story. So yeah, stories come from anywhere, and like this is just an example of the ones I've got, but this is the kind of thing that's happening in local stations all over. And yeah, you'll know if you make a podcast, there are stories everywhere. So I do have all of these stories at my fingers that my colleagues have found, but I'm a big believer that I could go into the street now and talk to one person and find a great story. So I found my stories, and then I do some episode planning, and you can probably see on the wall behind me some post-it notes, and this is genuinely how I episode plan. So I make a note of all the stories that are coming through, and I do it digitally as well, but I do find that the post-it notes really help me. And I do that because once I've listened to some audio and I like it, then I want to start thinking about how to link it in with others. So I've already mentioned that I look for themes, and I like the themes to not always be super obvious. So sometimes they have been a bit more literal. I mean, the last one that was released last week, that was called Hidden History. So I had a story in there about a woman who didn't know that her husband was a spy for all the years they've been married. I had a story about this village where there used to be a wildlife park, but there isn't anything there now. And then I had a story about the Apollo 11 mission and a British engineer who'd worked on it. And just one tiny part of the story was the fact that him and some other engineers inscribed their names on a little bit of equipment that got left on the moon. So that was kind of a secret, like, British mark on the moon. So it's kind of vague, but there's that link between them. I try and check that there's kind of diversity across, the whole of the podcast, but episodes too. So when I mean diversity, I mean in all realms, actually. So I want to be making sure I'm getting stuff from all over the country, from lots of different stations. That people are kind of bringing different life experience. They're from different cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. I don't want it to just be kind of one perspective. So I tried to get a little bit of that across, gender as well, all sorts of things. And then also when I get to this point, if I'm thinking, right, okay, I definitely want to use this bit of audio again, I then go back to the person who originally recorded it, the producer or the presenter, and I get the contact details of the person who was in there. So like I say, some of this audio, some of it can be a day old, some of it can be 5 years old. Generally, it's somewhere between a week and a year old. But, just because the person spoke to BBC Radio Bristol doesn't mean that they spoke to them thinking that's where it was going, and they didn't know it was going to go on a podcast. Now, kind of officially, if you've spoken to the BBC and been recorded by them, then the BBC kind of owns that audio. They don't own your story, but they kind of own that audio. But ethically, it doesn't feel quite right for that, because if I went and told my story to Radio Leicester, I presume I'm thinking, okay, well, it's going to go out in this area, and it's going to be online for 30 days, and then it's going to go away. But I'm putting on a podcast that's going to be uploaded to the whole world, and it's going to expose their story wider. So for me, it's really important to check that they're okay with me reusing it in that way. And also, stories can move on, and people aren't always happy, but generally people have. I think I've had like one thing where a guy was a bit like, no, I don't want you to reuse it, but I rang him and explained how it was going to be used, and explained that, because it's over quite a controversial subject, how I was going to tell it to see if he was happy with that. And he was. So it actually ended up being good. And then when it was released, he was really happy with it. But that's kind of really important. So if you're in a situation where you're going to be reusing audio that was used elsewhere, then it's important to do that. Sometimes it's difficult. And to be honest, there's been somewhere I've reused phone calls where people have rang into the radio stations, and they haven't necessarily, because they weren't proper contributors, they haven't kept their contact details. And then it's kind of a case by case thing. So, if they're not particularly sharing anything that's too controversial, and also they're anonymous, you're not including their name, then sometimes you just have to make a judgment call on it. But yeah, I think it's important to to kind of cover that point. So yeah, 3 or 4 episodes basically. So let me just come out of here and keep an eye on time. So I'm going to skip past that bit. So, so yeah, then let's see, what do we do? So once I've decided what's going to be in it, I'm going to do this and share my screen again. I'm getting faster at this now. There we go. So then I get on to editing the tape. So I'm going to speed up now because I've actually been talking slower than I thought I would. Okay, so editing the tape. This is my editing setup when I work from home. So yeah, I am pretty much just working on my own. There is not a big, in local radio, we tend to work on every part of what we're doing. So when I was a producer doing the live show, I'd be researching, I'd be writing scripts, I'd be editing audio, and then I'd be there behind the glass talking to the presenter. And the podcast a little bit mirrors that because I'm doing the researching, the scripting, the editing of the audio, and presenting, etc., etc. So this is my little setup. So first, initial editing, I just block edit. So I kind of edit down what I've got. I label the audio, and then I think about looking for a story arc. And this is kind of the first thing that makes it slightly different from radio, I guess, because in radio, people can tune in at any time. I think the way you often structure radio, or certainly, the kind of radio where you're doing this live radio that we do in local radio, is that you're kind of going in there often with a headline. So the kind of cue into the audio, the cue into the interview is often that headline thing. There's not so much teasing out as what you do in podcasting, I find, because you want that storytelling. You want to kind of hook people in, not reveal it all from the beginning. And you can do that in podcasting because people are listening from the beginning and hopefully to the end if you're keeping them there. With radio, they could come in halfway through. And you might, I don't know, it's a different kind of listening. I mean, certainly people do just sit and listen to the radio, and people certainly do listen to podcasts while moving about, but it tends to be a lot more in your ear and a lot more focused. So yeah, you can play a little bit with the audience, and you don't necessarily have to maybe spell some of it out as much as you do before. So that's what I tend to do. So I tend to, block it out, take notes. I'm saying all this like I do it in a really linear fashion, and I don't, but this is trying to explain largely how I'm doing it. And I tidy up the audio too. So when I say that, I mean that there's a lot of ums and ahs in live radio, and there's bits of the audio as well. Like, so as much as I say that the local stuff can be maybe universal, there's some stuff that really is too local, like references to local people or too many references to local places. Sometimes if people are talking about an event that's past. So I try and take out all that stuff that detracts from the core story. And block it out in that way. I am just going to, I think I'll skip past this because I don't want to run out of time. So after kind of getting a bulk of what my stories are, I then start thinking about scripting. So the scripting is kind of, I kind of mainly do it in my head. So I want to be there to be a guide and kind of add context to the story. So the first interesting thing about the scripting and the fact that I present it is that wasn't always the plan. Originally, we were going to get a proper presenter to do it because, my experience is production, and my presenting in the past has been very limited. It's basically been when other presenters have been ill, and it's always been with someone else. And I think I once did a documentary, which wasn't great. So I've had to really develop my presenting style, and I think I can hear the difference between series 1 and now. But I really wanted it to be very natural, and I've learned a lot of this from podcasting, and I wanted to make sure it was heavily scripted, and it is heavily scripted, but I wanted it to sound as natural as possible. And the way I tend to do it is I think about it. I think about the audio I've got once I've blocked it out. I tend to move away from the screen and think about it. I write down notes, and then I kind of try reading it a little bit with the audio. I might record some, and then I'll re-script it, and then record, and then re-script. And that's how I do it. And kind of part of the point by doing it, and this goes back into how do you make the local universal, is I try and think of ways into it that kind of open up the stories. So I'll think about some of the themes that are coming up, I'll think about the specific stories, and I'll try and pull out stuff and think how it relates to my life and how it might relate to others. I might put in quite open questions, which is actually a bit of a local radio trick of thinking, well, how does it affect you? But yeah, more and more I've brought in little bits of my life, and I don't want me to be the focus of it, but I mean, my hope is that, you know, if I let you a little bit into my life, then maybe you'll trust me a little bit more to be a guide, and to show that, you know, this is genuinely audio that I'm passionate about, and that I'm willing to share as much as the people are sharing a lot. So I wanted to play a little clip here. This is a bit of audio that I recorded with my dad. So I did an episode called Secrets. And actually that was really difficult to write around, because it's quite difficult to write scripts around secrets because people generally aren't willing to share them with you. So this was to get into kind of quite a difficult story, because it was a story about a guy who'd found out that his uncle had murdered his aunt, and then it was in the 50s, and then his uncle was hung for it, and he didn't know. And that's quite a difficult story to get into, but this is how I ended up doing it.
Hello? This is my dad, Dave, putting on a fake accent.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hello. I got somebody telling me that my IP address had been compromised.
Did he have any secrets for me?
I don't know, really. I can't really. You put me on the spot a bit there. Ask Mum.
Okay.
Mum, Rebecca, have we got any family secrets? Yeah.
My mum, Claire, was a little more fruitful in her storytelling, reading off one particular family drama which started with a very awkward reveal. But Mum was clear that I didn't have permission to repeat anything she'd said to me, particularly on a BBC podcast.
They can still have an impact on people, can't they?
So I'd kind of given up on bringing you anything from them when Dad called me back. He'd suddenly remembered a little secret my grandma had kept for over 40 years.
When Mum died, we were emptying out the house, and in her own wardrobe, buried under a load of handbags and shoes and two pieces of old carpet, we found my old school report, which must have been about the last one I had, which she'd obviously hidden from my dad.
And had you ever seen it?
No, at that time they were sending them straight to your parents because people were losing them if they were bad reports.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm guessing it wasn't a good report.
Oh no, it's not good, no. I'll read some of the comments to you if you want.
Okay.
French, determined non-worker. Local studies. Since he came to this class, he has never worked. And this is the best one. This is from Headmaster. A tragic commentary on human endeavour.
Oh my gosh! That's so harsh.
Well,
And what did you think when you found it? Like, how did it make you feel about the fact that she'd hidden it?
well, I expect you saved me from getting some sort of punishment for it, but I'd already left home by that time, so it was funny it was still there, though.
Yeah, I feel like you're quite proud of it.
I am quite proud of it. I kept it. I didn't contemplate on having it framed.
It sounds like my grandma was operating alone with this particular secret. But imagine the opposite. That you find out you're possibly the only person in your family, or even your entire town, who wasn't privy to the full facts.
Oh, I was probably 15 or so, and that only came out by accident.
So that's basically how I moved into that story about murder. I hope that works. But yeah, I mean, it's just difficult to make these things relatable. You can be the judgment of whether it does. But yeah, and it's been nice pulling in. I keep joking that my friends and family, no one is safe. I'm kind of joking, but they really aren't, because eventually I'm going to have to include everyone in there. But going back to the recycling theme of this presentation, actually, you know, when we talk about recycling, it doesn't just have to be audio. It can also be stories, because, you know, we'll all have those stories. Like, actually, when I rang Dad and asked for a secret, I wasn't actually thinking of that one. I'd forgotten about that, but he had told me that story before. And we'll all have those stories in our life, and that exists and actually could translate well to podcasting. In fact, a lot of the people that we interview for local radio stations, they're probably stories that they've told before. And yeah, you can just pull them out again. So there's that element. In fact, in the last episode I did, which was the hidden history episode, which I've already mentioned, I actually went back to my hometown and I had a tour guide around it, and I also went back to the place I used to work at, and I had a tour around that, and it was kind of me revisiting a place and learning more about it, and then passing that information on to the audience because it was actually really interesting, and I wish I asked sooner. So there's often stories in familiar places too, so this reversioning, recycling can sometimes be as simple as looking at what's around you. So moving on quickly, so from then on, so I've scripted it out basically, and like I say, this isn't linear, like I don't necessarily do in this order, but this is pretty much the order I do it in. And then after that I want to spring in other elements. So again, let me share this screen with you. So here we go. So this is one of the stories from that same episode that you just heard with my dad talking. So it was about secrets, and this was about this amazing secret society in Cambridgeshire, in the University of Cambridgeshire, that's been going for years and years and years and years. And basically students largely, get up onto the rooftops, the historic rooftops, and clamber around. And Chris Barrow, who's a presenter at Cambridgeshire at the time, had made this documentary about it, and had spoken to former night climbers. And he'd beautifully scored it with music, but we don't have the rights for the music that he used. So all the music I use, we don't have a composer. All the music is from an audio library that I use. I tend to use the same piece of audio, a couple of pieces of audio per story. You'll notice. So each story within an episode will have its own music, and so they're kind of quite segmented. You can almost take them out as individual stories and use them like that, which is actually something we've done and used it elsewhere. So yeah, it's all audio from a library. So luckily he had saved the project that he'd done separately, so I had just the original spoken audio without the music, so I could play with it. So let me quickly go to this. So this is just an example. So I use an editing system called Dira, which some people know as VCS, and it's basically what one of the editing systems that the BBC use, particularly kind of the news. So BBC 5 Live use it and local radio use it. It is not necessarily the best software for doing craft radio, because it is mainly made for being kind of news clips and that kind of thing. But the reason I use it is because it's a system that whole of local radio is using. So when I'm pulling in audio from the 39 stations, it's much easier just to pull it into this. And to be fair, this is a system I trained people to use, so I know it quite well. I know there's better ones out there. Well, not better, but ones that are more for the purpose of this, but this is what works well for me. And it's quite basic editing, I think, that I do. So just to give you an example. So I had this bit of an intro to this piece.
As you pass round each pillar, the whole of your body, except your hands and feet, are over black emptiness. Your feet are on slabs of stone.
So it was basically a reading from a book that was about night climbing. And then I just bring in little bits and bobs. So he's talking about being on a roof, so I wanted to bring in some sound effects where I can. I try to use authentic sound effects, but I think there's a little bit of the audience know he's not really on a roof when he's reading this, so I can bring in a little bit of fake audio, nice bit of wind. And then I also thought, okay, let's bring in a little bit of music too. And I like this feeling of being on the edge. Bring it all together.
Those with a fear of heights should avoid visualizing this next bit.
As you pass round each pillar, the whole of your body, except your hands and feet, are over black emptiness. Your feet are on slabs of stone, sloping downwards and outwards at an angle of about 35 degrees to the horizontal. Your fingers and elbows making the most of the friction hold against a vertical pillar, and the ground precisely 100 feet directly below you. If you slip, you will still have 3 seconds to live.
So there you go. Like, it's just a little tiny bit of audio, but just to show you how I can add stuff. And again, here you go. This is this is some night climbing. So this is a picture of Tom Whipple, who I believe is now the science editor for the Times, the newspaper. And he was a night climber, and Chris spoke to him. And again, the original piece of audio was actually an interview that they did down the line, down at ISDN line. So, they were in two separate studios, and, I wanted to bring a bit more atmosphere in for listening in your headphones, listening to your podcast. So the original bit of audio was kind of a long piece of him talking, and then you can see here, so on track 2 in green, that's the original bit of talking. So I've just split up the audio and put some spaces in. Then the red along the top, see here is misleading the audience because this is set in Cambridge, and you can see that that is actually an Oxford bell. So I apologise for any bell enthusiasts for that. The blue is a bit of music I've put in, and then the brown at the bottom is a good bit of wind again. So again, it's just to add a bit more atmosphere. And and a lot of this I just do by ear because, like I say, this is a new thing for me, and a lot of this comes from just listening to other podcasts and consuming other podcasts and getting a feel for it. So this is what this sounds like. Oops, let me go back. There we go. And here we go.
You're sitting on the top of these buildings and no one ever looks up. You can be there, you can see the whole world going right below, and no one ever thinks to look at where you are. There was one occasion when I was 5 meters up a drain pipe and I was coming down, and a porter from one of the colleges came out and he had a cigarette, and I had to sort of stand there on this drain pipe directly above his head whilst he finished his cigarette. He never looked up. Then you start meeting people up there, and you realise there's this kind of continuum going back, at least a century and a half, and there are still people doing it, and you're sitting up there in the fog, and the clocks are chiming midnight, and you can't even see anything of the sort of modern world, and it feels extraordinary. So yeah, I was completely hooked. What were your favourite?
So again, it just adds a little bit something. It makes it a slightly different listening experience, and it goes back to that recycling of radio again. It is essentially the same story, but it's just told in a different way, and it's making a different use of the audio for a different audience. So let me just see where I am. So I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to rush through to the end. But yeah, so basically I add in all of that, and then I get feedback. So yeah, although I'm doing this on my own, I do have great people around me. I've got an editor, James. He listens to a lot of my stuff and gives feedback. And then I always try to get people who are outside, so whether it be my boyfriend or friends or colleagues, to have a listen, just to check, because when you get to know the story really well, you can sometimes lose sight of the meaning, especially when you're working on your own. And then I react to it like that. But hopefully this has been interesting. I know it's been really specific about my podcast, but as you can see, a lot of the stuff in terms of in terms of your own reversioning and recycling, some of it just comes from the people that are around you. Loads of people make very niche podcasts on interesting things that are interesting to them. So many people are doing that already, but sometimes if you're a bit stuck for inspiration, actually looking for, thinking about the skills that you already have. It might not be in radio, it might be in your particular profession, is something that you can bring into it. The stuff I've learned in my career has helped me do all this, even just the fact, practical stuff of the fact that having done all the training across the country means I have access to everybody's audio files, means that I can easily go in and get out the audio I need. It seems like a small thing, but it actually is a bit of a lifesaver. So yeah, and I think this is something that could work on other stations. Maybe you are part of a network, or maybe you're part of a community radio station, and you know that you've got great content out there and you want to put it out there. And I think sometimes, although the easiest thing to do is perhaps just kind of clip a show and shove it out there, that's not always the best thing to do and the best use of it, and maybe a little bit more work can make it something that is a different listen, that's more catered for a particular audience, really. And I think that is pretty much what I wanted to say. Oh, the only other thing that's funny about this is in terms of recycling radio, so all these stories are recycled, reversioned, from radio, from TV, but mainly from local radio. And then actually the podcast has now been also turned into a radio station in its own right. So we now have a show called Multi-Story Shorts, which goes out on Radio 4 Extra, which is a digital national station that the BBC has, which is a radio show of a podcast that is made up from the radio. So, a story can keep going and keep going and keep going. And, some of the stories that we've had on the podcast have also been turned into online stories, and videos and all kinds of stuff. So I'm a big believer that if a story is good enough, it can just keep traveling. I hope that's been insightful. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm pretty easy to find on social media. I'm Becca Bryers on Twitter. And all BBC addresses are first name dot second name, basically, at bbc.co.uk.
Becca, that's just an amazing story and presentation. I think a lot of us truly don't understand the methodology and the workload that goes in from a point A to a point N in creating storytelling. My show, I click record and just start blabbing. It's easy. But to put that kind of concentration into something and then be awarded for it is quite remarkable.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, the great thing about podcasting is there's so many different types of storytelling out there. And I think just talking into a microphone is just as valid as this kind. And it's good to have that variety. If we were all doing the same thing, it'd be a bit dull.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you being on, Becca. It's been a whirlwind for us, but we're going to continue to spin around the globe and bring even more content. We're going to skip over to Florida and the United States now. So I appreciate your efforts and the information that you brought to the world during International Podcast Day 2019.
No worries. Happy International Podcast Day.
Thank you. That was spectacular.